We'll get really started in a few minutes. And thanks to everyone for coming to this webinar and for anyone who's come to all of our webinars throughout the week for Student Visa Week. And also a big thank you to all of the hosts of the webinar and participants of this webinar. These are all ex-visa officers, and they also all are offering their services as a consultant on argovisa.com. So we're really grateful that they all joined us today. And so a few other technical things to go over is first the raffle that we're having that allows one person to get a free Argo Visa consultation. So how you enter the raffle is by tagging your friends in the Facebook live stream. I'll add a link to the live stream in the chat right now for people on Zoom who want to enter, and you can each tag is one entry. So if you tag 10 people, you'll get 10 entries into the raffle. So if you are interested in getting a free consultation, you can start entering the raffle whenever, now. And also a few other things. At the end, we will have a Q&A session that will be part of this whole session. We're going to keep it at an hour, including the Q&A. So if you're on Zoom, please send your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom rather than the chat. If you want, you can send your Q&A questions anonymously, so don't worry. And if you're on Facebook and you want to participate in the Q&A, you can comment on the live stream on Facebook. And we'll try to get to as many questions as possible, but of course, we'll see what we can do with time. So that's pretty much all of the announcements. Again, thanks to everyone for coming to our webinars throughout the week for Student Visa Week. And I just wanted to really give a warm welcome to all of these visa officers, ex-visa officers here. And just to go over their government experiences, between the four of them, they've had government experiences in Mexico, China, India, Sri Lanka, Honduras, Indonesia, Hong Kong, Colombia, France, and Iraq. I think that's all of the countries. I might be missing something, but we're covering a lot of ground here, and I'll let them take it away. And thanks everyone so much for joining. Yeah.
Thank you everybody for joining our live panel discussion. I was excited about all of the webinars, but this was the one that I was really excited about because it's always so much fun to talk to other visa officers. You know, we've been through some very similar experiences in our line of work behind the visa window, you know, having high volume of visa applicants to talk to. It is an extremely difficult job. I always commend my colleagues in the State Department who are doing this right now because it is really hard, probably the toughest job I've ever done in my life. And also, you know, there's a lot of similarities between what we saw at different countries, but there are some differences as well. And so hopefully we'll get to delve into some of our experiences and share with you some of our insights that'll be helpful to you, especially if you are an international student who's applying for your student visa this year. We want to be helpful and we want to answer all of your questions. So I will be moderating this discussion, and I'm going to just go around and have each ex-visa officer tell you a little bit about their experience. And so, you know, Swati, Lisa, and Ben, could you guys, and let's start with Swati actually, why don't you tell us how many years did you work for the US Department of State, and you know, what countries and cities have you served in? And also if you have any special expertise in any particular visa category.
Sure, I'm very happy to. So I was with State Department for 11 years as a diplomat, and I had 2.5 years prior to that with Justice Department and Homeland Security as an immigration officer. So between those two, I have cumulatively 7 years in just consular related work. So everything related to adjudications to immigration policy work. I served in Honduras, in Mumbai, India twice, and also on the Mexico desk at the headquarters in DC. When I did a lot of green card adjudications with the other agencies, my specialty became marriage fraud. And when I was serving in India,
having just the cultural background and the languages that were used in my jurisdiction, it really helped when I was doing green card adjudications in Mumbai. So they were able to, you know, free up a translator and allow me to do all those. And then a lot of, since I was one of the more senior officers and a bunch of junior officers in Mumbai, I ended up getting some of the meaty portfolios. So we had what we call the business executive program. So under that, I had the H-1Bs, some B1, B2s that were going for training, and L1s as well. I also had the student visa portfolio, the religious portfolio, and then C1Ds, which is a seaman and crew portfolio. And I got my fair share of otherwise complicated cases.
That's great, Swati. That's a lot. And I have to say your expertise has always really, you know, astounded our clients, and you've always been super helpful in Argo consultations. And I always get great feedback about your work. Lisa, could you tell us a little bit about, you know, how many years you've been with the department and your special areas of expertise?
Yeah, so Swati and I actually joined the State Department at exactly the same time. And I left the State Department in 2016. But before doing that, I had served in Jakarta, Indonesia, Colombo, Sri Lanka, Baghdad, Iraq, and most recently in Paris, France. Also, like Swati, I am a consular coned officer, which means that my area of expertise and my motivation, if you will, for joining the Foreign Service was consular work and doing specifically the visa side of things, less so the American citizen side of things. In Sri Lanka, we saw all kinds of different visa applications, also a lot of seamen, a lot of students looking to study in the United States, and obviously a lot of tourist applications. And then in Paris, I was the immigrant visa chief. So I did exclusively immigrant visas. And I would say that is my area of expertise, including, you know, any type of fraud that you would expect to see with immigrant visas. I also worked in DC in the visa office for legal advisory opinions, which meant I was there to assist consular officers who needed to maybe sometimes explain a little bit their decisions to attorneys, and also to help them apply complicated visa regulations or laws that sometimes aren't always applied correctly. So to provide clarification there and to be a resource and cover for consular officers out at our posts.
That's really amazing, Lisa. And just, you know, with your experience in the legal office, I just think of all of the consular officers I've worked alongside and just some of the tough, you know, questions that we're faced with, whether they're legal questions or factual questions. And definitely, I remember we always had to, you know, keep in mind that we can consult with legal back in DC to sort of help us make our decision. So that's really great. So Ben, why don't you take it away? How many years were you with the department, and what would you say are your areas of expertise?
Thanks, Mandy. Well, I was with the department for 6 years. I did visas in Guangzhou, China, starting off, and then I did visas in Bogota, Colombia. So I had China and Latin America. At the time, both of those were two of the biggest posts in the world for visas. So I definitely, earned my stripes during those two tours. My final tour with the department was as the press secretary and spokesperson at the consulate in Shanghai. And then I left the department in 2018. As for expertise, I've done non-immigrant visas, immigrant visas. I was in the fraud prevention unit in Bogota, Colombia. I've done basically the entire alphabet of visas and trained officers as a more experienced visa adjudicator, trained new officers when they came in on how to do those visas. Everyone's heard of the B visas for tourists and business people, the F visas for students, the H-1Bs and the Ls. But then there's other visa types that people might not be so familiar with, like the A's, the C's, the M's, even the R's. I've done them all.
That's great. Thanks so much, Ben. And even though I've spoken at multiple webinars this week, I'll just give a little intro of myself. I have experience at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, China, at the U.S. Consulate in Matamoros, Mexico, and finally at the U.S. Consulate in Hong Kong, where I spent some time managing the immigrant visa unit. And so I think between the four of us, I mean, we are just a wealth of information, especially for international students. Our focus this week is to help international students because, you know, it's been a really tough year last year. I know a lot of people who have started out studying remotely are now looking to come back to campus. And there's a lot of questions because things are honestly changing all the time, but depending on the COVID situation on the ground in the country where the US Embassy or consulate is at, but also, you know, what's going on with the State Department back in DC. And I, I love my colleagues because honestly, I'm looking at these faces and it sort of makes me feel like I'm back in a consular section again, just because, you know, and this is probably a bigger section than in some of those like one person posts where there's just one consular officer. So it's always a lot of fun for me to get together with other former visa officers and sort of talk shop and talk about, you know, how we used to look at cases, student visa cases in particular. And so I'd also like, you know, each of these ex-visa officers to talk a little bit about, you know, what drew you to the work that we're doing at Argo, and why do you think, you know, a consultation with an ex-visa officer is valuable for visa applicants? And why don't we start with Swati?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for that question. So I had already been doing visa consulting work prior to joining Argo, very exclusive, tailored consultations. So I already understood and know the value that we bring, and as former consular officers who understand both sides of the window, you know, as I say, because at least in Mumbai, we had that bulletproof glass between us and, you know, the applicants. So I can appreciate both sides of it. I also really like about Argo, the user-friendly platform that it provides both for officers and for the visa applicants that come on board, because there's so much versatility in terms of the technology. We can connect to any applicant anywhere in the world, depending on our expertise. And we're providing really legit guidance. So also, another thing I really appreciate is because we have such a wonderful pool of ex-visa officers on our team, that there's resources amongst us. So even if, you know, I might get a questionnaire ahead of a consultation that may be a little bit more complicated, I'm able to bounce it back with colleagues on the team and see if, you know, there's something else that we can do or how we might go about certain complicated cases. So with that cumulative worldwide experience, it really, I find it really helps. And I think as Argovs, we have a unique expertise. You know, there's no agent or even an immigration lawyer that can really provide the kind of guidance we do. And that's because we have been on both sides of that window. You know, we understand what it's like to actually adjudicate, to be in a proper setting of a consulate or an embassy, at a mill, what we call a visa mill. So all of that stuff, you know, lawyers have the expertise, but they've never been behind that window to necessarily understand what we are seeing and what we are experiencing, how the process is going. And then agents, at least in countries like Mumbai, you know, they're a dime a dozen, and they have a lot of cookie cutter kinds of services. So I think as Argos, we have a very unique USP.
I think that's such a good point, Swati, because I find that most people who try to help visa applicants in their line of work, they are, you know, just basing their experience off of feedback from their previous clients. And I think this is the first time that, you know, people are able to get information from the source, from the people who are making these decisions and why we make these decisions the way we do. And, you know, and I always talk with our other Argo officers, or Argos as we call them, that there is such a strong sense of consular culture that unless you've done this work and understand the pressures that we face, it's really hard to kind of understand where we come from and how we make these decisions. And so let's take it to Lisa. You know, what really drew you to the work that we're doing at Argo, and why do you think, you know, a consultation with Argo is different than a consultation with some other type of agent?
Well, I mean, I've always been a big proponent of legal immigration to the United States. When I went to law school, it was to become an immigration attorney, and it was my area of focus in law school. And I see working for Argo as just a natural extension of that to help people during their visa interviews, because I know for a fact that there are qualified people that get refused every day. I have personal close friends who've been refused for a visa, and it was because they weren't prepared or they were prepared for the wrong types of questions. So I see my role as an Argof to give people kind of that sneak peek of what it's going to be like at their interview, not just the kinds of questions they're going to get, but the tone of the interview, the length of the interview, and also too what a typical consular officer might look like is different from perhaps what you've imagined. So I think it's all good exposure, and I think it can really help people during their interview so that if they are qualified for the visa, that they get it and that they're not tripped up by some innocent mistake.
Such a good point, Lisa. And I remember thinking that when I used to be on the visa line, you know, sometimes you just don't really know. And instead of having the time to be able to really figure it out, it almost feels like it's safer to just refuse someone, which is really unfortunate for that visa applicant because, you know, maybe they sent the wrong signals or something that they did innocently raise some red flags. And so let's bring it to Ben, last but not least, you know, what really drew you to your work at Argo?
Well, I had a similar experience to that you had, Lisa. I had a personal friend when I was stationed in China who was going to apply for a visa, and she asked me for any advice before she applied. And the consular officers, when they're in the State Department, have a very strong standard of ethics where they need to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. And so even close friends, family members, they won't give them any advice on the visa process because that would, you know, there'd be proprietary advice that they're giving people that they know that's not available to the general public. So I told her, you'll have no problem. I knew what her job was and her education. I thought she'd have no problem. And she got refused. And I had no idea why that would have been. And I told her, that's weird. You should apply again, but without giving her any advice. And she applied again and she was refused again. And I realized then that this process is a black box for people on the outside. There's a lot of people purporting to have, you know, some inside knowledge or, you know, that secret sauce or that information that's going to help you get your visa. But unless they actually worked behind that window, approving visas and sometimes having to deny visas, they don't really know what's going on. And so I realized at that moment that I had this special knowledge that comes along with a very deep knowledge of the Foreign Affairs Manual, of the immigration regulations, and also of how things work inside an embassy, but also that empathetic knowledge of how people are doing this job on the inside. After doing tens of thousands of these visas alongside our colleagues and peers who we talk about with them, you know, we work just like we do in Argo. We talk with our colleagues about these cases and we learn how people are thinking about these, that I've got this unique skill set that can help people not go through that same situation that my friend went through. And so after I left the department, it was just one of the number one things I always knew I was going to do was I was going to put this knowledge to use and help people avoid an unnecessary refusal like that.
Thanks so much, Ben. And I completely agree with you three. I think that, you know, Argo's work, and I think you guys can all agree with me, after every consultation I do, I just feel so gratified because it really feels like I've made a difference in somebody's life. And I did not necessarily expect to feel like that when I first started doing the work. So it really is life-changing, at least for me, and incredibly humbling because, you know, when you're a visa officer, oftentimes you were just trying to get through the number of cases that you were doing, but to realize now to have the time to work with people one-on-one and realize how important this visa interview really is and to be able to think about that has been really great for me. So what were some common mistakes you used to see visa applicants make at the window? Why don't we start with Swati?
Sure. So I think a lot of times, you know, they wouldn't have paid their CVIS fee. didn't have an updated I-120 from their school in case their program changed, the duration changed, if their fees changed, anything like that. They didn't fill out the DS-160 correctly. And one of the big things is answering questions without really listening to the question. And that stems from from being coached to give certain kinds of answers, cookie cutter answers, which end up making the applicant come across very robotic-like. And they're not then able to express themselves more naturally, to reveal their true intentions, what they wish to do with X, Y, or Z degree, why they really want to study at a particular university. So those kinds of things I would really notice.
Thanks so much, Swati. Why don't you jump right in, Lisa? What were some mistakes
Yeah.
you see?
I take Swati's point that you don't want to come off as coached in practice, but I would say that one of the most common mistakes I saw was that people would let the consular officer do the work in the interview. Like, we shouldn't have to be dragging answers out of you. So when a consular officer asks, for example, why do you want to study in the United States? You should have more than a one-word answer or one sentence answer. Or if I ask, well, why do you want to go to the United States? To say to study. It's like, well, I know that that's on my computer screen. And I really think it's incumbent on the applicant at the first opportunity to volunteer that specific useful information that's going to help us make our determination. So for example, if the first question is, why do you want to go to the United States? The answer should be more in line with where you're going to study, what you're going to study, why you want to study that, and why you want to study it in the United States. That saves us a lot of breath. I think another common mistake, especially if you're doing the interview in a language that is not the consular officer's native language, is to speak slowly and perhaps to say the same thing in a couple different ways to make sure that that consular officer is really hearing what you're saying and processing it. I mean, we were joking the other day that as a consular officer, you don't really have to understand every word an applicant is saying. So having that knowledge, you want to make sure that your consular officer is really understanding what you're saying as well.
That's so true, Lisa. Thanks so much. What do you think, Ben?
I would like to say something unique, but I'm just going to have to reiterate what Lisa said, because that's the number one thing for me. When people say study or tourism, you haven't told me anything, right? There is a presumption that you as a visa applicant have immigrant intent, right? It's almost guilty before you prove yourself innocent. The burden's all on you. If you don't give the visa officer any information that allows them to issue the visa, they can just refuse the visa and move on, and they're validated by the law. So it's on you to go in there proactively and give them the information that makes it easy to issue your visa, right? Whatever that visa officer asks you, if they say, why do you want to study in the US? Where are you going to travel in the US? Whatever the question is, the answer that they want is information that makes that decision easy for them, right? They want that information to pop out so that they see it and they know very clearly, oh, yes, this is a good issuable visa. I can put in these notes with this information, issue this visa, and then move on to the next one. So, you don't need to memorize something, but know what your story is, know what it is that visa officer needs to know about you to make that decision quickly, and then have that information at the tip of your tongue, ready to tell them when they ask you something.
Yeah, you want to make the consular officer's job easy for them. And going back to the last question, I mean, I think this is another thing that's good about the Argo consultation is applicants will get a sense of how many questions they get and how short the interview really is. I think people are often caught off guard that their opportunity to make their case has passed a lot quicker than they would have thought. I had an applicant who came in once with a briefcase. He opened up his briefcase on my counter like he was about to start his legal arguments at a trial. And I'm sure he was really disappointed at how short his interview was. And that it wasn't going to be a day-long trial for him. So I think the consultation, in the sense that we give a simulation, is good preparation for having an idea of, okay, how many questions do I get before I really need to get my message out there across to the officer.
I think that's such a good point, Ben and Lisa. And just thinking, you know, I'm also a U.S. immigration attorney, and just talking with some of my immigration attorney colleagues, it is hard to strike that balance, because on the one hand, you know, I hear a lot of immigration attorneys tell their clients, just say as little as possible, because that gives you less opportunity to screw up. And which is true in a sense, but the one word answers used to just be so exhausting, because you would ask 5 questions before you're able to get any sort of substantive information or response out of the applicant. And that definitely will not make your visa officer very happy or make their job easier in making a decision. And on the other hand, you know, a lot of clients that I've even seen come through Argo, it's like it's like word vomit. You know, you ask them a question, it's like that, like everything comes out, because they want so much for the visa officer to understand their situation. And I think this is why Argo is so valuable, because we can really tell you, you know, what is going to be relevant and important to your case, and how to really, you know, get the visa officer to, you know, sit up and pay attention to you, which I think is really key to having that confidence to acing the visa interview. So thank you guys so much.
That's a really good point, Mandy, about it's not give them all the information immediately. It's you need to know what the important information is and give that to them in a very concise, condensed form.
That's so true.
I couldn't agree more with everybody too. You have to help the visa officer help you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Help us help you. Okay, so this is kind of an interesting question. I like to hear what people have to say about this. What is something that you wished visa applicants would understand about consular officers and what we do at the visa window? Let's start with Swati.
Sure. So, you know, since we're focusing mostly on students here, I'll make it particular about students. So you have to understand that, you know, your visa officer is also just a human. We have also been in that process of applying for colleges and, you know, trying to figure out what we wanted to study and why we wanted to study somewhere. So we can relate to, you know, the motivating factors. So you have to understand that, you know, that it's not a rocket science. We don't plug in something into a formula and a magic answer kind of appears. You know, we're having, but we're also, you know, when they come with the canned answers, and you know, a lot of students will be like, oh, because the professor to class ratio, student ratio is wonderful. Or they're kind of, you know, read off things from the website that they've memorized. But we understand that, you know, there are other factors that go into you choosing your college. It could be things like you had friends who studied there, or you still have friends who study there. Maybe, you know, it's you have family nearby, so you have a support system. Maybe the cost is affecting it, the location, all those kinds of things that we can understand and it makes even more sense for why you would want to study somewhere and choose to go there, etc. So it's just more about having a conversation. We have no innate desire to prevent you from achieving your dreams. You know, we have no quota system or other randomness. We just want to best understand your intentions in a brief conversation, you know, and the legitimacy of your reasons. We have no set of predetermined questions. A lot of people really wonder that, you know, and we have like 1, 2, 3, and if they answer like this is how. No, it's, you know, based on what my first question is and how you answer is usually how our second question then gets developed. And you'll have a few questions just based off of that conversation. It's also not about the paperwork. You know, a lot of clients like to shove the paperwork, but in student visas, for example, it's what's required by law that you have to bring. You know, we want your I-20, we want your CVIS fee, we want to know that you can financially cover it, but everything else is, you have to consider it as supplemental. And I know, you know, a lot of agents, at least here in India, you know, they try to push like, oh, you really got to get all this paperwork together. And so then the clients, when they get denied and you hear, you know, oh, they didn't even look at my paperwork. So a lot of times you're trying to explain to them, well, it's not about that, you know, it's about that flow of the conversation and how did you answer and stuff. So, and we used to joke sometimes, and I really want to reiterate because I'm surprised sometimes how many times people think, you know, oh, they have a quota. And so we would joke that, you know, no, we didn't just come into work today and decide that everybody that's wearing red gets a visa, or only the people that have ties on get a visa. You know, it's not frivolous like that. We are taking into account the INA, our training, you know, and as Ben said, we have to, in non-immigrant visas, the law presumes that you're an intending immigrant. So it's about overcoming that.
That's such a good point, Swati. And I feel like this is really why it is so hard to give generalized visa advice. And everybody wants to know, okay, what's the answer to this question? But really, it depends based on who you are, your circumstances, how old you are, your travel history, your family history. And so this is why sometimes when we answer questions, we try to, you know, give a response that will be applicable to a lot of people. And that can be really hard, and why an Argo consultation is so valuable. Because I think, you know, it's always so funny to me, somebody will get refused a visa and they were asked a certain question, you know, like, which school are you going to in the United States? And maybe their answer is, oh, I'm going to this community college. They were refused a visa. So then they think that is the reason why they were refused. And now they're out there on the internet or telling all of their family and friends, you can never apply to a community college and get approved a visa, which, as you know, we as visa officers know, ex-visa officers, that is just simply not true. And so, like Swati said, it really depends on the flow of the conversation, how you're presenting yourself. And just because one person is asked a question and they responded a certain way and they were refused a visa, it may not be the reason why they were refused that visa. And so I'd love to hear from, you know, Lisa and what she thinks.
Yeah, I mean, well, when I was doing visa training, we were actually briefed specifically on the benefits of having international students study in the United States. So we are predisposed to want to issue that student visa for every qualified applicant. But I think what would be helpful for applicants to know is that the officer that you meet on the day of your interview may not look like they are predisposed to approve anything. And that could be for several reasons. Not everybody who is doing visa interviews dreamed of doing visa interviews when they became a diplomat. We're also under a lot of time pressure to get through as many applicants and to make our decisions as quickly as possible. And it's sad but true that I think it's really easy to carry over the emotions from our last interview to our next interview. So when you approach your consular officer, they may not be in the best of moods for any variety of reasons, but that should not stop you from making your pitch, from being enthusiastic, from being confident. And I think knowing the reasons why a consular officer may not seem very friendly at the time of your interview can help keep you from taking it personally. Don't let it bring you down. Like you're there, you have a clean slate, and perhaps after your interview, the officer will be in a better mood even for the next applicant. So I would say that's the one thing I wish people knew, is that they shouldn't take it personally. It is supposed to be a diplomatic exchange. We're not technically law enforcement officers, but you know, as you said, consular officers are human too. And if we think that there are some answers that we're not getting at, then you might get some more direct questions. So, you know, when I do my Argo consultations, I flip my face for those simulations because I want my applicants to be prepared for the worst case scenario and to be ready to handle a consular officer that maybe isn't feeling particularly diplomatic that day, and to know that it's not them and it doesn't mean that their visa is about to be refused, to not get discouraged, but to persevere.
So great. Thanks so much, Lisa. That's super helpful. What do you think, Ben?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely the truth, and something that applicants need to understand is that the visa officers are human. And part of their situation is that they don't have all the information. They don't have all the knowledge. They have a little bit of training and then they're thrown into this job where they have the absolute responsibility and authority to make the decision on issuing or refusing that visa. For instance, on the CVIS form, they know that a student needs this. They know what the important data is on that form that they need to know. They don't know actually how students get that form. They don't know who at the school fills out that form. They don't know who a DSO is. They don't know how a SEVIS transfer happens, but they still have to make a decision on that visa, right? Which is, and here's the other thing, they are under a lot of time pressure. They need to make that decision within 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes optimally. So they're under a lot of pressure to make that decision with limited information. They don't know about the school that you've applied to. They may have never seen it before or heard of it. They don't know about the major you're applying for. They might not know about the province where you come from. They might not, they don't know about your family situation, but they still have to make that decision. And knowing that, you need to make sure that the information that they are considering is the information that you want to get in front of them. I would also say, like with regards to community college, obviously those are perfectly legitimate universities where many Americans and international students are doing their studies. But when the officer does take into account the totality of someone's application, if someone applies to Harvard and gets into Harvard, the officer can assume, okay, this person already presented their entire academic CV to Harvard, and Harvard said, okay, this person qualifies to study with the top students in the world. And so Harvard's kind of already done that vetting before they come into the interview. If someone's going to a community college, while it may be a good college and they intend to do their studies there legitimately, that community college might not have very stringent admissions standards. They might not require an SAT or ACT. They might not require TOEFL scores, which means that while legitimate students are getting admitted, there could be some students who aren't really legitimately planning to study who have applied there and been accepted. And that's why there's going to be more scrutiny if you apply to a community college. You're definitely going to need to prove that you are as legitimate a student as that student who's been accepted to Harvard.
I think that's such a good point. Thanks so much, Ben. And I know we get a lot of questions about community colleges versus four-year universities. So I hope that's helpful to some members of our audience. Okay, so I love this question because I'm actually curious to see what you guys think too. People often ask us, they've had their visas refused a number of times. Can you explain certain situations where you would consider issuing somebody a visa, even though they have been denied, one or more times? Swati.
Yes, sure. So, it's always best to come to us for an Argo consultation when you're going for your first time, because then we can prepare you the best way possible. But and the thing you have to understand is that every time you get denied, it makes it that much harder for you to overcome your situation. It's not impossible, but it is harder. So you have to then put in more effort. So if on your first time, it was because, you were really nervous and you couldn't, you didn't understand the questions and you couldn't explain yourself, the second time, you're probably going to be even more nervous, and you're going to have that from your first interview kind of playing in your head, even though you get a new officer. So in those kinds of situations, just you have to understand that all visa officers, I think I speak for, is that honesty is the best policy. And, all we really want is somebody to be honest with us about their intentions for the visa that they're applying for, and what they're going to do with it, and what they're going to do afterwards, and when they're going to come back, etc. And if you've made a mistake, it's not the end of the world, but the most important thing is that you own up to it. You apologize for it, that maybe you did something like a lot of, sometimes it's silly things, like on the DS-160, you have maybe an agent facilitate it and you haven't reviewed it yourself. And therefore, what is on your paper doesn't match what you're saying. So it could be, something like, do you have family in the US? And maybe out of fear, out of hearsay, because friends and family told you don't say that you have family in the US, even if you do, you might have marked no once. But then in the interview, it came out that yes, you do have family in the US. So that creates a confusion, and it leads the officer to think, okay, well, if they're lying about this, then what else are they lying about? You know, so you want to be very clear. You want to correct anything that you may have done, either, you know, purposely, and own up to it. Also, you know, another time is when you're able to better articulate, you know, and clearly explain your situation, your circumstances, and how they may have changed for you to now be able to better qualify for that visa.
Thanks so much, Swati. Such a good point. What do you think, Lisa?
Well, I think it definitely depends on why you were refused, obviously, the reason for the refusal. But the thing to know is that a consular officer is presuming that the previous decision was a correct decision. So now if you're coming back for a second interview, your hurdle is even bigger. And what your second interviewing officer is looking for is a change of circumstances that would give them a reason to overcome the previous refusal. So without that, it is hard to overcome a refusal. We would not recommend you just apply again to play the visa officer lottery to see if you get a nicer officer, because that second officer may be nicer, but she's presuming that the previous officer's decision was the correct decision. But refusal, you can overcome a refusal. I've overcome previous officers' decisions many times, sometimes even overcoming lifetime bars for applicants, but they have to demonstrate a change in circumstances or an explanation for, if the problem is a lie, an explanation for the lie that's believable in order to overcome that refusal.
That's great. Thanks so much, Lisa. What do you think, Ben?
Yeah, in my time at the State Department, I think I may have overturned at least 1,000 prior refusals. But that's just me. I definitely had colleagues who may have overturned one in their entire time. And it comes down to the officers having sole discretion whether to issue that visa or not. And that includes prior refusals. A second officer can approve any visa that's been previously refused, as long as there's no, what we call a hard ineligibility. If you got 214B before as your refusal, the next officer has the sole authority to issue your visa or refuse it that next interview, right? It's a completely new interview. But things that will come into play are, unfortunately, that every officer is different, and their personality, how willing they are to go against their colleagues' previous decisions, it takes boldness. It takes some bravery. You're asking that officer to be brave and to go against what their colleague, who they work with every day, has already done. They might not necessarily, have to tell them that they've done it, but they know what they're doing is saying, okay, I disagree with what my colleague said, and maybe it's a colleague that they respect and they wouldn't want to do that. So when someone's been previously refused, especially recently, a lot of times the officer will see that there's a previous refusal and they'll want to get them through the door as quick as possible by asking the question, has anything changed since your last interview? Well, it may have been 1 week ago. So you might say, well, no, nothing's changed. That's all the officer was looking for. That gave him all the reason he needed to say, okay, nothing's changed since the prior refusal. You refused again. But what may have changed is that you didn't get to present the information that's important to your case to the previous officer. So you need to have that information. So then when they ask you that question, you can say, well, the officer didn't consider this information because I never got to tell him or her this in the last interview. And then you get your window to get that new information in front of the officer and give them a legitimate reason to change the decision, right? Oh, it's new information. It wasn't that my colleague was wrong. It's my colleague didn't have complete information. Now I have complete information and I can issue this visa confidently. And I'm not just, flying in the face of my colleague's decisions.
I think that's such a good point, Ben. And I feel like, from talking to all three of these former visa officers, it's, and I completely agree with this, it's a bad idea to get refused once and then just hope that the situation will be different next time. You want to do something different so that you can rectify that situation if possible and to get things turned around. It would be crazy to go in there exactly the way you did the first time or the second time, hoping for a different result. And so I would say that if you are a student who has been refused a visa, or any applicant who's been refused a visa and you're planning on applying again, consult with Argo before you do that, because we can help you point out, you know, some of the things that might have gone wrong, or some miscommunication or misunderstanding, which is all very possible because, you know, visa officers have to make these decisions in a very short amount of time. And one other thing I wanted to mention too is that keep in mind that every single time you go into an embassy or consulate and have that visa interview, it's all going to be in your visa record, and your visa record is for life. And every single visa officer you talk to will have access to the notes of the previous interview. So you really want to do the best you can to keep that record pristine, so there's not a lot of problems in it, you know, causing, you know, your next visa officer a lot of headache and not really, you know, being willing to approve you that visa because there's so many things wrong with your case. So please keep that in mind.
That's a great point, Mandy. I do also want to add something that's really important for prior refusals. That those notes will live forever, and any officer in the future will be able to see what went on in that interview. But that's the only place where that exists. No one can tell you why you got refused with certainty, right? No agent, no one has a connection with the embassy. They can't ask them. They can't, you know, there's no way for anyone to know what happened in that interview other than having those notes. And even looking at those notes, sometimes I would see a previous refusal and think, well, I would have just issued according to this information. So don't believe anyone that tells you that they know for certain why you got refused. But we, as the former visa officers, who I did over 60,000 visas, I'm sure that Lisa and Swati and Mandy, I know you did 100,000. It's that experience and that empathetic, that cognitive empathy we have with other visa officers that allows us, better than anybody else, better than visa agents, better than immigration attorneys, to intuitively know what it is in your application that could have caused that officer to give you a 214B. So we'll admit to you from the very beginning, we do not know with certainty why you got refused. But we can also tell you that of anybody out there who can give you advice, ours is going to be the most accurate.
I love that, Ben. I think that's such a good summary of what we're trying to do at Argo. And so I think, you know, I could keep going with the questions, but I just see all of these, you know, Q&A questions kind of coming up, and I think we could start answering some of these questions. What do you think, Davis?
Great. Yeah, there's lots of questions. So I think a good one to start with kind of relates to what you all are talking about the refusals. And so do the visa officers type and record every single response that someone's saying during the interview, or is it just like a summary after?
They're probably typing just enough to justify their decision. So if they're refusing you, they're just typing the negative things that justify the refusal, unless they think that potentially you could qualify in the future. They may add that caveat, but they're not capturing the whole essence of the interview by any means. A few sentences probably.
I agree.
Okay, great. So the next question is, are U.S. consular officers trained on common cultural tendencies from the country where they're working? Sometimes applicants may come off as robotic because this is how they would normally communicate with people in authority positions and roles.
That is a very good point. Yes, they are trained. However, there's a learning curve. I arrived in China after already having lived in China for 5 years and having a master's degree in Chinese studies and Chinese history. I knew about China. I had colleagues, though, who had learned Chinese in the US and then arrived in China and were told to do visa interviews on day one. Obviously, there's a disparity in the level of cultural knowledge there. So some will know more than others. There is an attempt to have them trained in cultural norms for that country, though.
I'd just like to add on this point, you know, we usually have an assignment for 2 years, sometimes 3 years, depending on the post. And so even if we're, new to that culture, during the course of our assignment, we get very used to the nuances of, you know, the culture and what is applicable in certain kinds of visa cases and stuff, because we end up doing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these through the course of our assignment. So it almost becomes very second nature to us. You know, we can do them with our eyes closed if we didn't need the computer to type. So we do definitely accumulate some on the ground knowledge that helps us. And we have, you know, regular, there'll usually be internal staff meetings if there's something, you know, unique that has come up to maybe something in your jurisdiction. So to keep everybody abreast. But yes, in the beginning, we also get, usually we get kind of regional training to make us a little bit more aware of the culture we're going into, socio-political, geographical kind of basic general knowledge as well.
Okay, great. So another common question, is there any advice on dress code for the interview? I know we've heard this in other webinars, and it seems like people are really conscious about this particular issue.
I would say to not try too hard. I'm thinking about international students in particular. You probably, I don't know. I'm curious to see what my other fellow Argo officers think, but I always think it's best to dress like a student. So maybe that is not the time if you know, are gonna go crazy and get like crazy tattoos and like do crazy hair colors. Maybe that's not the time to do it, is before your visa interview. But you also don't want to try too hard. And, you know, one of our other Argo officers, also Argo's co-founder, yesterday and I were talking about this specific issue. And he was saying, you know, it always like is so funny to me when somebody wears an outfit that you could tell like they're wearing for the very first time. If they're wearing a suit, you can see all the crease lines of like when they took it out of the package, and then you know this person is really trying hard for their visa interview. So don't try too hard. Try to be authentic to who you are, but also keep in mind that the visa officer is looking at you as a potential student who's going to go to the United States and spend, you know, a long time there. So they need to trust in their decision that you're a good person to give a visa to.
Absolutely. The officer is only going to issue you the visa if they trust you, and trust is related to authenticity. You have to be yourself. You're not going to trick them by putting on a suit. If you're a hipster, dress like a hipster.
Plus, the other thing I would just add here is that, you know, if you're comfortable in your own skin with what you're wearing, you know, if it's more your normal kind of what you would wear, then you are going to naturally be more comfortable in the interview because you are feeling like yourself. So your nervous energy is not going to be as high also. So those kinds of things do add up, and they'll make a difference for you to make sure you're, you know, comfortable, you're presentable, but you're also feeling good in what you're wearing.
Okay, great. So we have an interesting question, and I think it would be really cool to hear what you guys have to say. So someone asked, can you all tell about the most memorable and unique interview you ever had?
I can start with that one. And I've told this story a few times during my webinar. So if you've seen me speak before, I'm sorry if it's a repeat, but it's actually unfortunate. I interviewed, I went for a temporary assignment at the US consulate in Chengdu, and I interviewed a couple a brand new newlywed couple, and they were going on their honeymoon to the United States. And they were actually interviewing with the wife's parents. And they said, you know, and the husband was saying, my in-laws are coming with us on our honeymoon. And I refused this couple right away because in an American officer's, you know, mentality, there is just no way that a newlywed couple would bring in-laws with them on their honeymoon. And so, and this sort of relates to what we were talking about, you know, whether or not officers learn about cultural customs. Sometimes we learn through visa interviews. And so unfortunately for this couple who was refused along with their parents, I only found out after seeing this repeat pattern over the next few days that this is actually quite a normal custom in southwestern China, where elderly parents don't speak the language and they're uncomfortable going somewhere so far away, but they do want to go see the United States. And so the younger generation, even though they're newlyweds, are doing this for their parents, sort of as a way to thank them for their support and to bring them along. So this is actually quite normal in China. And I didn't find that out until later. So sometimes visa officers unfortunately learn, trial by error through the applications that they deal with, through the visa applicants that they talk to. And if you're one of the first ones that I interviewed, you were unfortunately probably wrongly denied, but I learned and then figured it out for the next visa applicants. And so that's just a really memorable interview for me. And I actually ended up talking to the local staff afterwards, learned that this is quite common, wrote a cable back to the State Department, and then, got kudos, and everybody was like, oh, who knew that this was actually, quite a normal situation. So we do try to educate other visa officers on some of the things that we see at the window to prevent these types of mistakes from playing out on our visa applicants. And we, for the most part, I think visa officers try so hard to do the right thing, but we face immense pressure and, and we have a lot of limitations.
I just have a funny story. I was interviewing an elderly gentleman who did not speak didn't speak standard Chinese very well. And I asked him, we have to fingerprint everyone, right, when they come for their visa interview. And I asked him to put his hand on our fingerprinting machine. I was trying to mime to him, take your hand, your 4 fingers, put them on the fingerprinting machine right here. Put them right there so I can take your fingerprints. And he was confused, but then I saw he understood. And he took out his false teeth and put them in the slot and gave them to me through the window. And I was like, okay, we need to get some sanitation equipment over here. We need to clean this man's teeth. So yeah, I just have a funny story.
I have, amongst all of the experience that we all have, we have a lot of stories, really. Actually, there's many that come through the years, and it's hard to remember all of them. But there is one. Once I was in the Foreign Service, a lot of times for your post, you get language training, and it may not be your first language. So I had, but you get kind of very formal language training. So I remember an officer, this wasn't my own thing, but I was passing her window on the way to my window, and she had been trained in, I believe it was Gujarati, and but it was very, very formal Gujarati. So, but it's not what is really spoken, right? So she's interviewing, I'm passing by her window, and she's interviewing this young family of 3. And the kid's in like grade school. And so she switches and starts talking to the kid. And she's saying, she said the word for something, she was asking him about, what grade are you in school? And the word she used for school was super formal. It was the proper formal word, but nobody knows it, nobody uses it. So all 3 of them were like, I could just see the expression like, okay, what is she saying? Plus she's not a native speaker. So, this goes to the miscommunications that can happen because of the language difference, the accents between either the applicant or the officer, the speed at which we talk and all that kind of stuff. And all the more important to ask to repeat a question if you didn't understand it or anything. So anyway, so she says this formal word, everybody is quiet. And then finally, and then the kid's like, what? And then she goes, school, what school do you go to? Or what standard are you in school? And I'm like, oh, school. Like everybody had a sigh of relief because like, oh, okay, yeah, he's in 4th grade, So sometimes that kind of miscommunication happens when we're trying to make our best effort to relate to the applicant in their language.
Yeah, I didn't know there's, I'm going through the Rolodex of interesting visa interviews I've had, and it's so hard to pick just one, but I think what really struck me interviewing people in Paris for fiance visas and spousal visas was the myriad of ways that people across borders can meet and get together. And maybe this was unique to French people, I don't know. from pen pals to Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan sites to, what's the farm game that you can play? Apparently you can communicate, on your phone where you build your farm. Had a couple that met playing that. So yeah, if you're single, I'd just never give up, because you never know how you're going to meet that special person in your life.
That's great. Thanks for sharing all those stories. So we're almost out of time, but I want to try to do one more quick question. Are there any circumstances in which you would recommend someone not to apply for a non-immigrant visa because there's no way that they would be approved?
I'll start with this one. So I wouldn't say, I would say, when we're talking about situation, if your situation has changed. So a lot of times, when applicants at our window would say, oh, but when can I apply again? Like, let's say they got denied, they would immediately ask, well, when can I apply again? We would tend to then, by law, they could really turn around and go ahead and apply the next day. But that was not going to necessarily change their circumstance if they came in, like Ben was saying, the next week. So what we would recommend to them, we would tell them that, yes, you can apply immediately if you'd like, but we would recommend you wait maybe 6 months in case something can change in your circumstance. So just to keep that in mind, that you really want to invest in making your case stronger, and you don't want to do visa shopping either. Before, like right now in India, the rules have changed and you can apply for your visa anywhere. But before, I'm talking about maybe 10 years ago, you could only apply in your jurisdiction. So when you saw applicants outside of your jurisdiction, it automatically put alarm bells up for people that, okay, they didn't get their H-1B in the H-1B visa mill down in South India, so now they're coming to India. They're coming to Mumbai. So you don't want to come across as you just desperately, no matter what and where, need to get a visa.
Okay, great. Well, thank you to all the panelists for attending, and also all of the attendees for coming. Oh, Ben, did you want to say something?
Oh, no, not yet.
Oh, I wasn't sure because you went off mute, so I was like, just in case. Yeah, so thanks everyone for attending, all of the panelists and all of the attendees. You can check out this will live on Facebook, so you can rewatch it or share it with your friends on our Facebook at Argo Visa for USA. FOR, not the number 4. And yeah, and I will announce the raffle winner in the comments of the Facebook. And thanks so much to everyone for coming. If any of you guys want to say one more thing, have at it.
We wish you guys the best of luck in applying for your US visa, and we hope that we can help you. So please come have a consultation with us. We're happy to help.
I second that. Yeah. It's good talking to everybody, and I hope that everybody has the best of luck applying for their visas.
Absolutely. Come see us. Come consult with us. We wish you the best.
Thanks, everyone.